Thank you, Mr. Dutton. It's an honour to have you launch the book. I think if you want a model for how a period of opposition can be a period of real renewal that can really set up a political party for future success, you only have to look at Robert Menzies and what he did between 1943 to 49. Ironically, that is just after this book, because Menzies becomes opposition leader after the 1943 election, where the United Australia Party essentially dissolves. And people want to talk a lot today about various fracturing of the centre-right and issues we might be facing, but they have quite short memories, because in 1943, such was the dismay amongst the UAP, the main party of the centre-right, that they actually let the country party leader, Arthur Fadden, act as leader of the opposition and lead them to an election. So things are a bit more stable and sort of settled now than they were back then. One of the things that putting this book together made me ponder was what sort of biographical subject would Menzies have made if he never returned to the prime ministership after resigning in 1941. Obviously, this is quite the hypothetical question, because in all likelihood, he would have re-entered the law and had a very successful career, perhaps ending up on the High Court, or at least being Chief Justice of Victoria, which his wife, Dame Patty, once said was his sort of main goal around 1942, when he's doing the Forgotten People broadcast, when he's having this period of real soul-searching. An interesting comparison can be made between Menzies and Joseph Cook in this regard. Most of you probably haven't heard of who Joseph Cook is. He was Prime Minister like Menzies at the start of a world war, wasn't able to see it through to conclusion, and has hence been forgotten. But he's really important in the history of Australian liberalism, because he's actually the first leader to win an outright majority in their own right at a federal election as head of a Liberal Party. And that majority included Menzies' uncle and political mentor, Sidney Sampson, who features in Troy Branston's chapter. There's a couple of really important distinctions to be made between the two. One is that Menzies, even in the first instance, did serve longer as Prime Minister than Cook. But the really important thing is that the First World War acted as the catalyst of the death of the First Liberal Party. It was ultimately sacrificed to this incentive that we must win the war at any cost, and hence the Liberals were subsumed into the Nationalists to allow Billy Hughes to continue on as Prime Minister after the conscription issue had split the Labor Party. Whereas Menzies, to his eternal credit, after losing office in 1941, and in this immense despair and sort of uncertainty of wartime governance and the Second World War, he called for what he dubbed very early on a liberal revival, and reforged Australian liberalism into the modern Liberal Party. And that is really his ongoing legacy. So I think with all the essays that feature in this book, we can really say that even if Menzies had never returned to the Prime Ministership, he would have still been a very important figure in Australian political history, and indeed legal history. One of the best chapters in the book is from Justice Edelman, who I'm very happy to say we have here today, and Angela Kitty Cowan, who talk about how Menzies fundamentally impacted Australian legal history with the Engineers case, and they also talk about decisions around the attempt to ban the Communist Party. In many ways, it's sort of a window into a legal biography from the other timeline, when Menzies never returns to the Prime Ministership. He instead goes back to the law and becomes that famous lawyer that he easily could have. That being said, this is no biography. There are certain limits to the biographical form, and I really appreciate the sort of essay-by-essay approach we have taken. Even, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this because he's an award-winning biographer, but even Troy Branston's chapter, you see the real benefits of looking at Menzies' childhood and his influences as a standalone account rather than as just the introduction to the meat of the story, which it too often is when you just take the biographical form. And David Kemp also brings up another shortcoming of biography, which is that it is not necessarily the best place to discuss complex ideas, and he identifies that A.W. Martin's otherwise masterful and classic two-volume biography of Menzies, its real shortcoming is not looking at his ideas. Kemp really asks for where is the Menzies of ideas and principles in the historiography of his political journey. And I don't want to go over too much of what Mr. Dutton has gone through because he's given a great overview of the book, but I really think that we've gone a great way to sort of rectifying that gap in the historiography. At least 4 of the chapters focus directly on Menzies' ideas and political influences. We've heard about how Judith Brett brings her expertise and intimate knowledge of Deakin and applies it to demonstrate how Menzies was a part of a long tradition of Victorian liberalism. We have David First Roberts really understanding how Menzies' Presbyterianism fundamentally shaped his worldview, his idea of democracy, why he wanted freedom for the individual, but at the same time, why he expected that individual to be a lifter and not a leaner and really put back into society. We have Greg Malusa's chapter on the universities, which I think is really distinct from modern conceptions of universities. Greg was my PhD supervisor, so I've got a bit of bias here. Greg's chapter is one of my favourites, and he sort of talks about this idea that Menzies had that the universities might be some sort of modern church, that he could already see that Australian society was secularising, that we might go down the path of only caring about things that were material. He wanted Australians to care about higher ideals and really drive forward the nation, and that underpinned his later revolutionising of university education. And finally, Nick Cater's chapter on Menzies' magnum opus, The Forgotten People, and how that was not just a political tract, but a blueprint for a method of governing that would fundamentally shape modern Australia in the post-war period. Then we have more traditional chapters that are not necessarily about ideas, but which still make very important historical points. I think Anne Henderson's contextualizing this idea that Menzies was an appeaser and proving that even in the 1930s as Attorney General and then later as Prime Minister, he went to great lengths to try to insulate Australian democracy against the threats of communism and fascism, which were really on the rise at the time. You have Frank Bongiorno in the great relationship between Menzies and Curtin, arguably the 2 most respected figures on their respective side of politics. And it really speaks to the fact that Parliament is a national institution that we do need to treat with respect and really have a sort of lift the standard of political debate and what we're actually trying to pursue in the national interest. And it's great to know that in our hour of greatest need during the Second World War, our leaders rose to that occasion. And finally, in the longest chapter in the book, we have Scott Prasser looking at Menzies, the learning leader. And Prasser's chapter arguably demonstrates exactly why this is not a 1-volume work about a politician whose career essentially ended in 1941, but because he was a learning leader, because he took the time away from office to have self-reflection and growth, it is the first of a 4-volume series that will look at the man who is arguably the most important political figure in Australian history. I've already received some of the chapters for the 2nd volume, which is based on our 2nd annual conference that we held at the University of Melbourne late last year, and I can't wait to continue with the series. Thank you.